Cambridge University is one of the oldest and most prestigious educational institutions in the world. It is from these walls that future researchers, scientists, and politicians emerge, the intellectual elite of the British Crown. Graduating from here opens virtually any door. It was here that Arnold Deutsch began his career, laying the foundation for what became known as the Cambridge Five. In Moscow, the British University was seen as the ideal place to recruit future agents. That's why a young spy, Arnold Deutsch, was sent to its student ranks. In addition to recruiting over 15 individuals into Soviet intelligence, he managed to establish a secret spy network, which later became known as the Cambridge Five.
Deutsch was an Austrian Jew. It's important to note that after studying at the University of Vienna, he briefly worked with Wilhelm Reich, a famous psychoanalyst who often said, "If you were subjected to sexual violence, you are a fascist."
Despite his background, Deutsch was a typical Russian agent who, contrary to his personal beliefs, recruited 2 gay men and 1 bisexual person into the ranks of Soviet intelligence. Although he personally disliked them, professionalism was his top priority. Meet the members of the Five. Kim Philby, Anthony Blunt, John Cairncross, Guy Burgess, and Donald Maclean. All of them were recruited during their university years in the early to mid-1930s. Within a few years, each of them had risen to prominent governmental positions, carving their way to key places in the country. One of them was even knighted by the British Queen. But we'll talk about that later. What united all of these individuals was one thing: communist ideology. The early 1930s were a difficult time for the world. Hitler, Franco, and Mussolini came to power. Their dictatorship posed a threat to all civilized countries. At the time, the Soviet Union was considered almost the only power that could oppose their regimes, though none of the Five realized that they were joining a regime that was no less brutal.
They saw the devastation caused by the depression in the British working class. They saw the angry marches and protests passing through Cambridge. It was also clear that Nazis were coming to power in Germany. They concluded that capitalism would not be able to cope with the approaching crisis, and democracy would not be able to defend against the looming threat.
Therefore, the only solution to the problem was Moscow. This is Kim Philby, the most famous and successful agent of the Cambridge Five. He was recruited by the Soviets in 1934. Soviet handlers sent him to Spain to report on the civil war raging between Franco's forces and the People's Front. Philby went there under the cover of a journalist, writing propaganda articles for Francisco Franco. Although his main mission was to assassinate the Spanish dictator. Since he was inexperienced in espionage, such a task was too much for the newly recruited agent. Over time, the idea of eliminating Spain's leader was abandoned. The fact is, Philby became a national hero in Spain.
In December 1937, Philby and 3 other correspondents were heading out for a report when a shell exploded right in front of their car. All the journalists were killed, and Philby sustained a head injury. Since he had written about Franco's achievements, he was awarded the Red Cross for military merit. This honor later granted Philby access to many Spanish secrets.
While Kim Philby gained popularity abroad, the other members of the Five were not wasting time either. This is Donald Maclean. When he entered Cambridge, he wanted to become a linguist and teach languages, but Soviet handlers chose a different profession for him: diplomacy. After excelling in the required courses, he got a job at the British Embassy in France. His authority and passion for his work quickly helped him gain the trust of diplomatic circles. Through Maclean, the Kremlin learned about almost all Anglo-German plans concerning the Soviet Union. The flow of information from Maclean did not stop. His continuous updates and knowledge of what was happening not only around him but also in the country at large allowed him to reach new heights later.
Donald Maclean was incredibly important. He had access to political decisions. He knew what positions countries would take in negotiations with the Soviet Union. Maclean was politically significant for Moscow because he knew who would act and how in the event of the occupation of various countries, the establishment of a government, or a coup.
In the 1940s, Maclean was moved to Washington and found new opportunities. He accessed documents on the U.S. atomic energy program. He lacked technical details, so capacities or components weren't discussed. However, he knew everything about the progress and stages of production in great detail. Philby occasionally visited the United States. He became friends with James Angleton, CIA counterintelligence head. This acquaintance soon developed into a friendship.
Once or twice, they sat down at a small restaurant and talked. Angleton would share all the information with him about post-war Anglo-American plans. He told him what was happening behind the Iron Curtain and discussed plans to destabilize communism in various countries.
The third member of the five is Guy Burgess. Burgess was a close friend of Kim Philby. After joining Soviet intelligence, he was ordered to get involved with the Anglo-German Brotherhood, a pro-Nazi group. This allowed Burgess to gather small bits of information about events in Germany, even some Nazi plans. But the young agent wasn't interested in this. He craved far bigger adventures than spying on pro-Nazi groups. Slowly, he began paving his way to the top.
Burgess was one of those English characters you read about in books. He was gay, very impulsive, quite affectionate, though a heavy drinker, but he was also incredibly calm, with excellent manners.
Burgess managed to get a job with the BBC. He interviewed many politicians, talking to them on various topics. Churchill was also one of his invited guests. It's obvious that British intelligence couldn't simply overlook such a character, so they recruited him. However, they didn't suspect that Burgess was already a Soviet agent. As Guy Burgess himself said, his homosexuality helped him stay afloat. After all, no one could have imagined that such a public figure might be working for several sides at once. Nonetheless, his work at the BBC opened doors to virtually any political office within the British government.
Burgess was successfully recruited, both as a member of the SIS and as a propagandist who was well versed in radio. He also worked for MI5. Agents used his homosexual connections to recruit agents into their ranks. He worked simultaneously for 3 different camps: the homosexual, the journalistic, and the secret one.
John Cairncross, the 4th member of the Cambridge Five, was also a member of the British Communist Party. His handlers placed him at Bletchley Park, where, during World War II, they deciphered enemy ciphers. It was there that they broke the Enigma code. As you might have guessed, all the decrypted messages were sent to the Kremlin for review. Therefore, the Soviets were always well informed. In addition to supplying information himself, Cairncross also recruited a few agents within MI6 to help him with his work. However, British researchers believe these agents were not very effective.
John Cairncross provided the decrypted ultra codes, which gave the Soviet Union incredibly precise information about the movement of German troops on the Eastern Front. The information he passed on played a crucial role during the Battle of Kursk.
Interestingly, John Cairncross could not be held accountable for his involvement in the Cambridge Five. In fact, until 1990, no one knew for sure if he was actually part of the spy network. Even though charges were brought against him, he denied any wrongdoing or cooperation with Soviet intelligence. The truth about him only came to light when Oleg Gordievsky, a Soviet agent who defected to the British, revealed it. Finally, the last member of the Cambridge Five, Anthony Blunt. In 1939, he joined MI5. Gradually advancing through the ranks, he became deputy head of intelligence. He undermined the work of British agents from the inside. When a Soviet spy was introduced into their ranks, Blunt exposed him. In the Kremlin, they used this method to catch nearly all the spies sent from London. Later, in 1945, he became an advisor to King George VI. Under his leadership, Blunt carried out various tasks related to the royal family. Interestingly, despite having access to compromising information, he never sent anything to the Kremlin. However, he did use his status and connections to gather political intelligence.
The information I provided was exclusively about German intelligence. I didn't give away anything about British agents or military capabilities. The information I provided was very vague.
Meanwhile, Kim Philby established connections with British MI6 and SIS. Moreover, Philby became head of Section 9, a unit dedicated to fighting the USSR. With such connections in the British intelligence community, he had access to any information regarding Moscow. The Kremlin received so many documents that today the amount of information passed on can be counted in the thousands. However, among these piles of documents, there was not a single one that indicated plans from London to send agents to the USSR.
He served as a senior officer in British intelligence, working within a specialized unit that was deployed with the primary and critical mission of gathering and analyzing intelligence related to the Soviet Union, aiming to provide crucial information for national security purposes. He was in charge of these units. And, as you can imagine, we were fully aware of where the saboteurs would land, where the weapons would be dropped by parachutes, and we had detailed knowledge of everything that was happening.
When the war ended, it became clear that the new enemy was communism. The Cambridge Five started to weaken. There are several reasons for this. Some researchers claim that the agents realized they were working for a regime just as bloody as the Nazis. Others believe the weakening of the spy network was due to Soviet intelligence's distrust of the recruited agents, as extremely important information rarely made its way to the Kremlin. As Anthony Blunt said, the data was vague. Nonetheless, there is a third version. The problem with the weakening of the Five was that two members dragged the others down due to their character.
On his way to the pub, Burgess dropped papers he had taken from the Foreign Office. He was practically always drunk, and Maclean couldn't keep his mouth shut. Once, he told his lover and brother that he worked as a Soviet agent.
In 1951, US intelligence agencies discovered that information was leaking from the British embassy. It became clear that one of the diplomats was passing information to the Soviets. They tracked him through messages and his code name, Homer. This code name appeared only in the places where Maclean worked. As soon as he moved offices, both the sent messages to a specific address and the code name disappeared. Philby learned about the exposure of the agent. Without exaggeration, he handled the situation very quickly and very skillfully.
Philby decided he had to warn Maclean. He made two decisions. The first was to alert their Soviet colleagues in Washington so they could come up with an escape plan. The second was to send a British diplomat to Maclean.
That diplomat turned out to be Guy Burgess, a member of the Cambridge Five, to warn Maclean that he needed to escape. In 1951, Maclean and Burgess defected to the USSR. They were searched for, but all efforts were in vain. Kim Philby had done his job. Although he knew that, sooner or later, the truth about who helped them escape would come to light. So he too had to leave. He quit his job in British intelligence and in 1956 moved to Beirut. Once again, he worked as a journalist undercover. He spoke little, listened attentively, and was always well informed about everything going on.
He never attended press conferences or anything like that. He wasn't even present when VIPs visited. He was not there. But every Sunday, a brilliantly written article about it would usually appear on the front pages of The Observer. We always wondered how he managed it. Where did he get his information from? He never left that pub.
In the same year of 1956, the Queen knighted Anthony Blunt. This was an unprecedented event. A Soviet spy received such an honor from the royal family. He began writing books on architecture and art. But this life didn't last long. In 1963, the intelligence services discovered who he really was. It was too late to back out, so he voluntarily admitted his guilt. In exchange for immunity, he promised to reveal everything he knew about the Cambridge Five. As for Cairncross, he had already left the country in the early 1950s, traveling between Italy and France. Each member of the Cambridge Five was exposed through the Venona program. This was a joint project of American and British counterintelligence to decrypt Soviet communications. While the existence of the so-called Cambridge Five had been known for a long time, no countermeasures could be taken, except through illegal means. The Venona project remained classified until 1990. Publicly revealing the names of the spies would have raised numerous questions from the international community. And this, in turn, would have threatened the national security of both countries.
In 1944, there was already some evidence that information was constantly leaking from the British Embassy in Washington.
Between 1944 and 1949, colossal efforts were made to decrypt the most secret Soviet telegrams. Meanwhile, in 1963, Guy Burgess died in the USSR. In the same year, US intelligence discovered that Kim Philby was a member of the Five. The agents were sent after him in Beirut. He was forbidden to leave Lebanon and forced to cooperate. He didn't comply and defected to the USSR that year. The Cambridge Five officially ended its work. Each former member of the spy network continued a peaceful life. Some taught at universities, others became specialists helping Kremlin agents.
I believe that, when looking at the history of intelligence as a whole, this particular case is one of the most fascinating and noteworthy examples, offering valuable insights into the complexities of intelligence operations. This case is unique and differs significantly from others in that, despite the complete exposure of this group, not a single individual was arrested or taken into custody, which is an incredibly rare and unexpected outcome in such circumstances. All of them lived to a ripe old age and passed away from natural causes. Remarkably, none of them were ever charged with any crime, none faced execution, and none were ever imprisoned for their actions. From an intelligence standpoint, this is, of course, a significant achievement.
However, the effectiveness of the Cambridge Five is only discussed in Russia. Western experts argue that their role in the war was exaggerated. Of course, they caused damage through information leaks. But in some cases, while Soviet forces succeeded in intercepting supplies or preparing for an attack, in others, Western intelligence skillfully regrouped. After all, they also have intelligence services, and they are just as powerful as the Soviet KGB.